Welcome to the Sensible Center podcast, where two middle-aged guys drunkenly talk politics and political reform. Grab an adult beverage and enjoy the show. Further information can be found at sensiblecenterpac.com. You can reach us at sensiblecenterpac@gmail.com or follow us on X at USASCPAC. Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
All right. Well, you got an early Christmas present from the Federal Reserve today.
It's absolutely wonderful. I can't believe it. Rates are dropping.
Rates are dropping.
Nice little
Bob,
bump in the stock market.
you're buying a house. Yeah, it's all good for you. I assume you're writing the thank you note to Jay Powell today, so we'll leave some time at the end of the day so you could get that in the mail to him. But as another bonus, Bob, we have a special guest today, Raaheela Ahmed from 100% Democracy is here today. Hi, Raaheela.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Raaheela. Thanks for being here. You're our first guest.
And you're our first guest, so I'm sure you're going to be the first of many, but we appreciate you coming on. Raaheela is the National Legislative and Organizing Director at an organization called 100% Democracy. I think I mentioned on the other previous podcast that I attended an American Democracy Summit. I think it was in October or late September, Raaheela. And we met and had lunch together. And Raaheela agreed to come on our podcast to talk about our organization. So we're really excited to hear about that. Let me give you a little bit background on Raaheela. She's been involved in political movements a great deal. She actually served on a county education board seat in Prince William County, was it, Raaheela?
Prince George's.
Prince George's County in Maryland. She was the Deputy Director of Fair Election Center's Campus Vote Project, which she was engaged in voting and civic engagement on college campuses, and also a manager at New American Leaders, where she was supporting a large network of first and second generation immigrant elected officials. So it's quite a distinguished background, Raaheela. And now you're involved with 100% Democracy. So why don't you give us a little bit of a background of that organization, its mission, kind of how you got involved with it, and then we could kind of go from there.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Bob. It's been, 100% Democracy has been in operation and alive for just about a year and a half. And the focus of the organization is really to redefine voting as not only a civic right, but also a civic duty, where individuals not only participate, but are required to participate in voting, whether that's casting a ballot or submitting a waiver saying that you don't want to opt in. So we're looking at the concept of universal civic duty voting, which is this concept of opting out of voting using an opt-out system as opposed to an opt-in system, which we have in the states right now. It was a very intriguing idea when I first heard about it. I actually heard about it through a working group that was going on through Harvard. And then following that working group, a book was written about this concept of universal civic duty voting, led by E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport, who now leads the organization that I work for. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about the idea, I thought, this is wild, can this work here? Is this is such a foreign concept to me, living in the U.S. and, my entire life. I was born and bred in Bowie, Maryland. And so to hear a concept like this, there were a lot of questions I had, but then also, as you had mentioned, I served as an elected official, a local elected official on my county school board for a couple of years. I've been involved in elections, campaigns, nonprofit, the democracy space for a really long time. And I think that it's really important to recognize that we're at a very fragile and pivotal moment in our governmental system in the way that it functions, where we have huge levels of polarization that we've never seen before or never had before in the same way. We've had a
Absolutely.
lot of, like discord amongst people that lead to just this immense sense of, misunderstanding. And for me, there's like, there are organizations and there are ideas that lead to small changes and reforms in the way that we operate to help alleviate some of those differences. But in order to really make a significant change and make sure that we have a democratic system, a democracy, a republic for not only for the next 5 years, but the next 50 years, we need to figure out a bold idea or a couple of bold ideas that are going to help us stay in that direction of maintaining a system of government that the world really looks at and is like, hey, this is a type of system that we want to see. So for me, that was the inception point of me wanting to join this team at 100% democracy. Was there is this big bold idea of universal civic duty voting. It is actually in state, utilized by 26 countries around the world.
Wow.
That's a lot of countries, and it spans almost every continent around the world, so it's not just localized in one place. But there's a system that many different countries use, but that's not really discussed in the US. And why don't we? Why can't we look at cities and states in our country and say, hey, this is what we want? We want everybody at the table voting in elections with the hopes that we'll be able to have a stronger and a better system for decades.
Right.
So this is the what drove me to join this organization. And I'm excited to chat with y'all a little bit more about kind of my learnings as I've evolved in my understanding of universal civic duty voting, coming from a space of being uncertain and curious to a point where I'm thinking myself that this is the bold idea that we need to save our
Yeah,
system for the future.
it's definitely a curious idea, and I had never heard about it until I met you. So, and I appreciate Miles sent me the book, and it was a great read. I learned a lot about the arguments for and some of the concerns with that were well addressed in the book. So it's a very interesting idea, I think, and I think you're right in regards to that. There's going to need to be a good handful of pretty bold initiatives to get us back on track from our democracy movement here in the U.S. So we're open to listening to any of them, and that's kind of the point of this podcast too, is to kind of highlight some of those movements and get people a better education about what's out there, and hopefully. With any of these movements, you kind of need a groundswell to get them up and moving. So you mentioned just briefly a little bit, maybe if you could go into a little bit about the mechanics on how this would work. You mentioned opt in, opt out. Maybe you can describe what that means. Clearly, in the United States, we all have or at least in theory, the ability to vote, right? We all have the ability to register to vote, to go to the polls. But you mentioned 100% kind of a civic duty. So, what does that mean, kind of from a mechanical perspective, in regards to what this is asking people to do?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different countries that operate this type of system in different ways. So in Greece, they have this law that basically says that folks are required to participate, but there isn't really much enforcement around it. Nonetheless, they do have very high voting rates as compared to other countries that don't have this system. But I think the best case in point that might be most comparable to the US is looking at Australia.
Okay.
And in Australia, they've basically had the system of mandatory voting, which was adopted nationwide almost 100 years ago in 1924. And as soon as they instituted this system where basically saying that folks are required to participate in voting, or, submit a waiver saying that they're not going to participate, using this kind of opt-out system, their participation rate jumped from around 60% to around 90%, and it's stayed there in almost every election since. So we're talking about a system that has dramatically increased voting participation of people. And they use a system in Australia it's a penalty system. So the penalty for not voting and for not providing a valid reason for not voting, it's a fine of the equivalent of about 15 US dollars here. I think it's around 20 Australian dollars there. And also they have this option for folks to submit a blank ballot. So you might be able to, if you go to the ballot box to cast your vote, you can vote for a candidate, you can vote for multiple candidates, or you can decide that I don't want to vote for any candidate and submit what's called a blank ballot or quote unquote donkey ballot. And so this is a system that they've used for for almost 100 years. There hasn't been, to my awareness, a serious effort to repeal the practice of universal civic duty voting over there. And in fact, they've had systems in place to celebrate election day, right? Make it somewhat of a celebration at the polls where folks stand outside. There's food involved. It's really about celebrating civics and celebrating the development and the continuance of a governing system that works. And so this is probably the most comparable analysis of something of what universal civic duty voting can look like in the states, but it's really up to cities and states on how they want to implement a system like this. And in fact, there's pieces of legislation that have been introduced in different states in the country already within the past year, looking at different options and ways to do that.
Great.
So you mentioned cities and states. I just want to
Mm-hmm.
clarify here, and I appreciate that. This is great. Um, are you referring to strictly state laws, or are we targeting federal laws, or all of the above, or federal elections, or all of the above?
Yeah, so I mean, I think with any type of movement, to go and start in cities and states to show that this is something that can work and really help in doing some of the things that we know we need to do in this country, namely decreasing polarization, increasing the amount of rapport and regard that's given to the needs of people directly by elected officials and politicians. This is something that needs to start at the grassroots. And so, what has happened so far in the past year is that there's been legislation introduced in Washington state and Connecticut implementing this type of a system where voting is required. They Neither of those bills have strict or strong measures for enforcement. But there's also been a bill introduced, an enabling legislation bill introduced in Utah, which would allow cities in Utah to enact this type of system. So that's kind of where we're at right now. There's no type of federal movement around this through our organization. There have been kind of national figures that may have taken positions or thoughts around what mandatory voting, what universal civic duty voting could mean for the country. But at this time, we're looking at what and how can we build an understanding of this in cities and states, especially in places where we feel could have the best infrastructure to make something like this happen.
I appreciate that. Um, does this, in your opinion, favor any one party over another? I just kind of
Well,
want to
that's,
follow that up,
yeah.
or qualify that by asking if you know if there's a recent country or state in another country or province that may have done this and how it affected their political leanings one way or the other.
Yeah, no. So when this kind of movement started in one of these countries, I want to say Australia, don't quote me on that. It was actually started by some of the more folks that were more on one side of the political spectrum than another, and with the hopes to be able to maintain a sense of power. Obviously, that's not the intention in bringing it to cities and states in our country, in the US. And it's, in terms of trying to move something like this forward, it would be really key and crucial to have if we're trying to get everybody out to vote, right, making sure that everybody's at the decision making table and trying to figure out what that happens across multiple party lines. But it's really, in terms of actual reality and how this could work out, it is very possible that this could favor one party or another given a specific area or a region, right? If there's an area or a region where there is a slightly larger base of Republican voters over Democratic voters, in a space like that, it could very much benefit Republican voters, or vice versa, right? You have a space where there's a larger population of Democratic voters over Republican voters. And so this kind of thing very much has the ability to favor one party or another in my eyes. But I think for me, that goes down to localities and specific areas. Overall and overreaching, it could be anything. And so I think when you're looking at it in terms of pockets, it's very possible that this could be one way or another, but ultimately, right, that's not the goal and that's not the intention. The intention is really to make sure that all voices of people, of citizens in the country are heard at the ballot box. And also the hope is that elected officials, as they're running their campaigns, as they're looking at how they want to reach people and what are those things that they really want to push as in terms of their agenda, are reflective of all of those people that they're trying to represent,
Yeah,
and not just a specific party or faction within that.
yeah. As I was reading the book and thinking about it, I was thinking, yes, it will likely be a wash, like you said, depending on the given dynamics of the locale. But in general, I would think that those who aren't voting are typically have been less engaged and could be more possibly moderate and easier to swing one way or another than sort of the people who go out and vote a certain party every election. So that is kind of exciting because, like you said, you might get some new voices and new thinking into the process by sort of engaging those people more through the civic duty voting. Is that sounds like what you guys have been thinking of too?
Yeah, I mean, the hope, here's the thing too, is like, there's so many ideas from existing politicians that really serve a base, right? Either left or right, in this country. And if we're really trying to move the country forward as a whole, as a collective, we really have to look at what are the needs of everyday people. And the way that you move politicians, the way that you move elected officials into thinking like that is if they can't feed or serve a base. If they have to feed and serve everybody in that capacity, then that could really change the game of not only what policies are being brought forward, but how elections are conducted and how our entire system and society functions as a whole, right? Maybe we'd be able to have a better system or some solutions when it comes to some serious issues of making sure people are housed, right? Making sure that everyone has quality food, these kinds of things. Maybe we would be able to address some really serious needs, policy needs, if those were the things that folks focused on, because those are the things that came to mind for everybody that's not only on the left and the right, but also in the middle.
Yeah, one of the things that's great, and one of the things I was thinking about is reading the book, and you had mentioned that in Australia they sort of make it a celebration, which I think is a great idea, because I was thinking, so it's hard to get Americans to do anything in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I went back and thought about the Obamacare and the ACA and trying to get people to sign up for health care insurance, which they were getting subsidies for, and it was difficult to get people engaged in that, and there had to be a lot of advertising. So how are you guys thinking about what's needed to get people to do it? And because, like I said, in this country we don't like to be told what to do, I don't think. Where
That's
other
true.
countries might have more of a mindset around that, I guess.
Yeah, no, we have a strong, I mean, this is our part of our national pride, right? Independence, freedom are a part of our national pride. And I think you're absolutely right. People don't want to be told what to do. I think the hard thing though is that there's kind of like a understanding of need and an understanding of balance when it comes to government intervention in people's lives. If we look at the way that our society runs now, we have, our government does mandate a lot of different things, right? There's a mandate for paying taxes and educating children and vehicle and safety emission, all these types of things. And there are a lot of benefits that come from some of those mandates. I think the most, similar thing that I can probably think of in terms of universal civic duty voting and a type of like government mandate is probably jury duty,
Right.
where in we're required to serve on juries, and that's to make sure that people that are going through the criminal justice system really have a chance to be heard by, and decision making to be conducted by a a group of people that's fully reflected of the diversity of our society, right? So, and even in the 1960s, a major goal of the civil rights movement was not only to allow African Americans to serve on juries, but in fact to compel African Americans equally to serve on juries as other groups of people. And so, in the same kind, using the same kind of logic, when we're talking about making decisions on important public policies and the election of people who should make those public policies, those should be made with the consent of all of the people that are governed. And so that's kind of the symmetry that I see between these two things. But it's very clear that the other thing too is a lot of people don't like going to jury duty either. But it's such so
I actually look forward to it because I
oh,
find it
that's good.
interesting. Right.
Me too. I love me a good jury duty. Although it's really I feel like they can see it in my eyes. They don't want. I don't often get selected, mind you.
I never get selected.
Oh my goodness. But it's an important part of our society to make sure that folks that are going through the system have a fair shot at being heard and hearing their point. And so this is there's a lot of kind of disdain for some of these government mandates, but I feel like if we're looking at things in the grand scheme of things, something like universal civic duty voting would help overall, more than it could hurt. And then the last thing I would say to this, and that's up for opinion based for sure, 100%. And then the last thing I would say around government mandates is I think about this a lot of, we have a system of selective service where a lot of our young men in the country are, uh, possibly they're putting their names in to possibly, have to give the ultimate sacrifice. And this is a part of the government system that we have in the US, and it's a part of other systems of government that they use as well, as a requirement of citizenship. And so I think about that, and that's such when you're willing and you're able, and almost in the sense have to participate in this process of possibly giving the ultimate sacrifice. I think about
Right.
things like universal civic duty voting, and I'm like, you know what, this is something to help us, and this is something that universal civic duty voting is such a lower lift, than something as important and as significant as something like selective service. That's also in
Absolutely.
the back of my mind too.
Yep. I got one more follow up, and then I'll let Bob jump in with some of his questions. Um, as I was reading the book again, I noticed that there's the carrot and the stick too here.
Hmm.
It sounds like most have gone with sort of penalties rather than incentives for voting, sort of either a tax credit or clearly a good sandwich could be an incentive at the end of voting. But how do you guys view that, or what's the mission in regards to that? Is it more on the penalty side? Do you think is more generally effective, or what's been shown there?
Yeah, so based upon some of the research that was done through the work group, penalties are more effective. But that doesn't mean that that's the only type of system of enforcement that's used, right? Like I mentioned before, there are some places that have no enforcement and still their voting participation rate is pretty high. There are places that have tried incentives as well, but it's just not been as effective as the penalty structure has been.
Okay.
I think the thing to think about there too is that it will vary based upon localities and states on how either penalties or incentives or no enforcement will happen. Nationally, though, if we were federally, there are really strict, anti-bribery type of laws. So to see this type of a system used in a federal race, or in elections where federal races occur, to be able to do any type of incentives would be difficult. And unless there is kind of a national change or a national law that's put in place. And so that kind of limits the ability of the incentives to move forward to a certain degree. But you have so many races, so many elections where, you're just voting for your mayor or your city council, right? You're
Right.
just voting for some local government. There are state races that don't occur in the same cycle as federal races. And so there are ways to be able to look at state laws and local laws to see if incentives are possible in places over penalties, if that's something of consideration for a locality.
And honestly, I think some of those local and municipal races are even more important for affecting people's lives, and they tend to have lower turnout, I think,
Mm-hmm.
generally than the presidential. So I think, as you mentioned, getting the locals starting at the grassroots or ground level is probably going to be even more effective for getting those numbers up.
Mm-hmm.
So I've thought quite a bit about this over the last few weeks in preparation, and the biggest concern I would come up with in regard to required voting would be potential First Amendment requirements. Can you talk a little bit about how this will align and fall within the First Amendment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as a part of the working group that came out of Harvard, there were some legal scholars that looked at this issue carefully, and their conclusion was that so long as there's no requirement to vote for or against any specific candidate or measure, there is no quote unquote compelled speech and therefore no constitutional prohibition from using the system. So, as long as there is a system that allows for folks to, submit a blank ballot or not requiring that folks complete a ballot, like there are other options to allow for, non voting if there's definitely, not a particular candidate or a particular issue that someone wants to vote for or against, then it stands to reason that this wouldn't violate any First Amendment laws federally or nationally.
And
Having said, yeah,
yeah, I just kind of think of it from the standpoint of if somebody wants to protest by not voting, I think that protest falls under First Amendment rights. And that may be covered by the blank ballot
mm-hmm,
idea or initiative that you called out, but I wonder if that takes it far enough, or if somebody wants to say, I'm going to protest, I'm not going to vote, whether or not that falls within their First Amendment freedom or not.
mm-hmm,
Actually, Bob, when I was thinking about it, I thought it's a bigger protest to show up at the polls and submit a blank ballot than not showing up at the polls, because I think from my perspective, if you don't show up at the polls, you could just be not engaged or not paying attention or a variety of reasons. But to actually put through a blank ballot saying I don't want any of these people, I think that's
And
an
I,
even stronger.
I think it provides potentially a path for a stronger third party candidate from the standpoint of a protest candidate, right? So, as a protest candidate, if you will, and you can stand up for some very strong things, or you can say some outlandish things, you may find that in protest, people vote for that individual, and then the big party candidates may lose large, which is interesting to me. I just don't know if it'll stand up in court.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, I think this is why the legal scholars kind of took this into account as seriously as they did. I think that having said what I've said, there's nothing that, it is very possible that this, has some type of legal challenge. But the hope is that, and the thought is that it would be able to withstand it, given kind of the way that the folks have looked at this. But you're absolutely right that with anything new, I feel like there's going to be some type of challenge and pushback to ensure the validity of a system, and that's not something that's out of range based upon what we've heard in terms of concerns and challenges too.
So basically, it's got to become operable or law somewhere, and then most likely there could be a legal challenge down the road.
It's possible. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be very possible that something like that occurs. Though the with the hope that that's not going to be the case.
Right.
But it is, it's very possible for something like that to be considered and thought about seriously by folks that may be really concerned about one element or another of passage of this.
The point is trying to make change, have
Hmm.
reform, try new things. Because we know we've got some problems politically. We know we've got some problems systemically. This is it's great conversation. It's a great idea to just try to move forward, try to change things, and then see what happens down the road, right? Speaking of change, I know you've got some other election reform ideas that you believe in. Could you talk a little bit about the other election reforms that you believe would be enacted with this and why, or you would like to enact with this and why?
Yeah, no. So I think one part of this that needs to be considered and is kind of the reality of the situation in the U.S. is that there are efforts at voter suppression. There are efforts to whether that's intentional or unintentional, there are people that don't have an easy way to access the ballot box, or in cases are limited in their ability to access the ballot box in the way that they see fit. And so, in terms of looking at places that, in order for a system like this to be successful, these kinds of thoughts about voter suppression, these kinds of efforts at voter suppression, whether they're intentional or unintentional, need to be kind of dismayed and moved away. And there are some really interesting reforms to help increase access to the ballot box that may help in advancing the success of a universal civic duty voting system if it's enacted. So things like same day voter registration or automatic voter registration, things like pre registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, things like allowing for vote by mail and allowing for early voting, these kinds of systems to increase access to the voting box, which many states have done at least one or more of these things, could really allow for a system like universal civic duty voting to advance and be successful in spaces. I think one of the things that could be really problematic for a system like this and other election reforms as well that are going on that are adjacent to this kind of thought, right? You've got ranked choice voting, you have proportional voting, you have mobile voting, you have all these other types of systems in place that folks are looking at. When you're looking at those types of systems and you're looking at universal civic duty voting, things like increasing access to the ballot box and making sure that there are systems in place to allow people to vote easily, swiftly, securely is really key in making sure that you have a system that works and that is successful. Without it, it can be really, we may get into a further system of distrust, perhaps, amongst people. You may have further concerns around the validity of elections, as been, a
Right.
rising concern around a faction of people. And so, in order to make sure that these types of movements of trying to make our system better actually make our system better. We
Right.
need to make sure that there are ways to allow people. We're setting people up for success and not for failure. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
generally think if we're going to move in this direction, we need to continue to invest in our electoral system, right? I think it's something we've always taken for granted, just the mechanics of it, right? And I think in 2020, I think a lot was done to open it up, primarily because of the pandemic. It seems to have been fairly successful, but I think putting more money into how we go about doing elections, if this further drives us in that direction, I think that's a great thing. One of the things I appreciate I agree with all those types of reforms that need to kind of be involved in this. But one of the things I was thinking of is there sort of more of a civic education here too? Because I think back to the founding fathers, and clearly our franchise for voting, they had a different thought about it back then. And the history of this country has kind of been continually opening up that to more individuals, more citizens, as we've kind of gone along. But how do you view sort of civic education and getting sort of the knowledgeable citizens also that people are engaged in the political process and knowledgeable about voting when they go to the booth? I mean, is that part of this too?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Civic education is very key and crucial to making sure a system like this works, right? So, in theory, if universal civic duty voting was enacted in a specific area, you would think that the schools and the public officials, employers, these types of organizations, and individuals would all kind of shift toward enabling and encouraging citizens to participate in this type of self governance. So I think I'm thinking of if every 18-year-old were required to vote, I would imagine schools would have a strong incentive to increase the priority of civic education, knowing that that's what's coming, right? So I think if we're looking at civic education from that lens of trying to encourage it in schools and encourage it in communities, that would definitely enacting universal civic duty voting would be a great motivator to make sure that that is something that happens. And it would also be a great prerequisite to allow for the success of that kind of system. I see it kind of in like a flow chart, one feeds into the other. I also feel like, though, if you think about it from a sense of just education of individuals and campaigns and elections, it kind of goes back to the concept of elected officials would be more in this type of system incentivized to inform all people about the platform that they carry in order to gain support
That's
and to gain
true.
a vote, you know? So instead of just super voters, folks that
Right.
have voted in every election, getting all of the election information, everybody, ideally, I would think, I would imagine if I was sitting as a potential candidate in an election cycle where I know that every single person is going to be coming out to vote, I would be trying to reach out to every single person, knowing that they're going to come out to vote, or in assuming that they're going to come out to vote, and assuming that they're not going to take another avenue of casting a blank
Right.
ballot or a waiver,
That's
right?
that's
So,
That's interesting. I didn't really think about that all the way through, but you're right. A lot of the politician and the campaigning's going around basically preaching to the choir, right? And
mm-hmm.
by opening up, or at least having that more of a, not a threat, but a real possibility that more people are going to turn up at the polls, right? Um, that they're going to have to expand who they're talking to, and even from a policy perspective, hopefully.
It also potentially spreads campaign funds thin, though, right? Because if
Mm-hmm.
you've got to speak to everybody, people that you wouldn't normally speak to, potentially, you know, a lefty in rural conservative Tennessee, if you will, still going to have to engage those people, which is not a bad thing at all. But having to engage those people and spend more money there, Be interesting to see the effect that has overall on the campaign cycle and their campaign spending.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think when we're looking at things of that nature, of the amount of individual funds that would go into and be required by campaigns to in this system, that's something that is, very much unknown and unclear when it comes to the effect that of individual campaigns and candidates and how much they would have to spend. I would say though that there may be it may this using this type of system in conjunction with it being if it were to be a government mandate, it would be great for government entities to consider using systems that would allow for generalized public information and knowledge. I know in some places in California, there are folks that can. There's kind of like almost an education guide of candidates of who are these candidates and what do they stand for, and you can, and that goes out to individuals. There's other organizations that do these types of things in terms of candidate information on the side, but to have a government entity also provide that could make some sense in making sure that individuals get the information that they need about candidates. So they kind of but that also takes into consideration that it's just moving instead of candidates using funds, it would be government entities using funds, right? So and that would be taxpayer dollars. So it's kind of the effects of funding, where it's coming from, who needs to raise it, and how it comes through is very much up for debate as well if we're looking at a system like this.
I wanted to touch base on something you spoke about a little bit earlier, and you discussed concerns with voter suppression. And specifically, I kind of want to talk about concern about voter ID,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's many concerns about people's ability to go and get an ID. And some of those reasons, obviously not all of them, but are because of poverty, lack of access to information. Wouldn't these people disproportionately be likely to get fined for not voting if they're unable to get an ID? What makes them more likely to be able to get to the polls and vote?
No, that's a great question and a great kind of thought. It's thought provoking in the sense of I would imagine that if every citizen was accounted for, we wouldn't be talking about registration in the same way. We wouldn't be talking about voter IDs in the same way. And in fact, we've had some folks, I've had some folks, I can speak specifically to myself, conversations with folks that are way more right of center that have even brought up this conversation about voter fraud, perceived voter fraud from their perspective, and how if there is a system like universal civic duty voting where there is an accounting of every citizen and whether or not they vote, not vote, cast a blank ballot, submit a waiver, then there is less concern around the opportunity for folks to take advantage of a system. And in fact, they felt like there was probably more security in the system, knowing that there was an accounting for everybody. So with that kind of perspective in mind, I think that even the conversation around voter IDs, the necessity of them and how they would be used, could be up for debate and up for question as well.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Just to kind of a couple more questions, kind of more towards where you're at as far as the movement goes, kind of your strategy going forward at this point. You had mentioned that there were a couple states that were looking into it, but kind of where you're at as far as building out the movement and where you see kind of what's happening in the next year or two.
Yeah, so this is a very new idea in the States, as I mentioned before. A big part of our strategy right now is just public education, making sure that organizations, that people in community, that elected officials, that public officials are aware of this concept, aware that it is in place in multiple different countries, and thinking about possibly, what could this look like here in my locality, in my state, in my area, with my people. And so public education is big for the next coming years, making sure that folks just are aware that we can have it a different way here, and this is
Right.
what
I
it
mean,
could look like.
we've both been involved in the democracy movement for a while, and it was a new idea to us. So I can understand how that kind of grassroots education needs to go on.
Absolutely. So that's a big part of the strategy. And in other places, there's been legislation that's been introduced. So continuing conversations in those legislatures with those elected officials, with those organizers and organizations in those spaces to talk about what this could really look like in terms of implementation for their city or their state. So continuing those types of conversations would be vital. And then the other piece of it is just continuing to see and talk to people about what this could look like in terms of support, right? Looking for folks that are willing to say, "Hey, I'm willing to take a chance on the system in the States. I've seen how it's worked in other places, and I want to be an advocate for this work." So it's the education piece, it's the finding advocates piece, and it's the moving legislation, or I should say, supporting the idea so that folks that want to move the legislation can move that legislation forward.
Great. Well, hopefully we did a little bit of educating of our listeners tonight, which I think we've had a pretty good and in-depth discussion. Can you kind of just let our listeners know where they can find out more about your organization, kind of what they can do and what's available to them at this point to kind of either get involved or be more educated and kind of spread the word?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is 100%democracy.org. That is percent spelled out PERCENT instead of the percent sign. So feel free to reach out to me, to other members of our team, if there are folks that you feel like, hey, I want to have a conversation with somebody in my, I want to get a group of people together to talk about this, and I want someone there to kind of guide our conversation or to talk to us about this and see what it's about more, and to have that type of intentional internal dialogue. You can reach out to me or to anybody else on our team for that. The website has more information about how to contact us, and also has more information about publications that you can read if you're interested in learning more about the concept.
Right, because you're right. A lot of that conversation and a lot of that push, we all become overwhelmed by this being too big of things, but it always starts with that first step and doing that on the local level, or having those conversations amongst your friends and your colleagues and whatnot, and that's how it all starts, right?
Absolutely. These virtual Zoom rooms, these couch conversations. Invite me to your dinner table.
Right.
I'll be there. It's kind of, I can be there virtually,
Yep.
maybe not, maybe not physically, but virtually, because it's just, these are I really appreciate the space that both you and Bob have created in having conversations about things that are different from different perspectives, because I think that that's what's lost in our country right now, right? It's this ability to sit down, look at an issue, look at a topic, have people with different opinions and different thoughts talk about that thing in a cordial way that with the understanding that everybody means well, right?
Right. Yep. We're just
So,
trying to do our little part here, but we really appreciate you coming on and educating us about 100% democracy. And listeners, feel free to reach out and read the website, read some of the book is a great book. I encourage everyone to get the book, 100% Democracy. It's a good read. It has some it'll make you think about all of this more in depth. But we just want to thank you for coming on our cast, and we really enjoyed it.
thank you both for having me.
Yeah, this was absolutely great. Thank you much.
All right.